Hello, cyberspace on the interweb. This is Mr. Hosking here to talk to you a little bit about the age of reform. Today, we are finishing up our industrialization unit. We've talked about industrialization being a movement from, I'm sorry, Mr. Beller, if you have the pleasure of learning or knowing Mr. Beller, he's doing his fancy funk dance in the classroom, so it's pretty distracting if I'm unable to continue with this video, or if I start laughing, it's because he's just funking it up in this classroom right now. But we've talked about industrialization and being the movement from an agrarian society into a urbanized society. And we've talked about the haves and the have-nots. And now I'd like to talk about some of the reforms that are going to eventually take place to fix the problems of those poor working conditions for the lower class. The first philosopher that we have to talk about industrialization is Adam Smith. He is a proponent of capitalism, which is all about free markets and specialization of workers, so that you work on one task and become really good at it, and somebody else works on another task and becomes really good at it. And then when you guys work together, you're able to produce a lot more than just an individual would be able to produce. These capitalistic ideas all deal with laissez-faire. It's that French idea that comes from the philosophes during the Enlightenment, where the government shouldn't interfere with markets. Markets are going to fix themselves, and everything will work together. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo capitalized or coined the term capitalism. And it's one of our vocab words, so we should already know the definition. It's an economic system in which money is invested in businesses with the goal of making profits. All of the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, are all owned by individuals. The second philosophy we need to know is socialism, right? Some people oppose laissez-faire. They think that the government needs to improve people's lives. A lot of us would make the argument that part of the job of a government is to make sure that people's lives are good. They should protect us from foreign threats as well as internal threats or local threats. The first two thinkers that really tinker with this idea of socialism are Jeremy Bentham and Jonathan Stuart Mill. They talk about utilitarianism, and it's a really interesting concept that we hate in the United States. Utilitarianism is all about creating things that are useful in society. So if we were to talk about shoes, what's the point of shoes? It's to protect your feet and allow you to walk distances without getting hurt. So really all we need is one style of shoe, one white sneaker. That's all that needs to be produced in our society if we were a utilitarian society. You don't need Nikes or Reeboks or Asics or Adidas or New Balance. All of that is fanciness that you get because you want to look pretty, or your Jimmy Choo shoes or whatever pumps you want to wear. That's all about looks and style and feeling pretty and feeling good about yourself, or looking cool on a basketball court. It has nothing to do with the utility of a shoe. So in a utilitarian society, we would destroy all of those companies. They'd all go away, and we would only produce one style of shoe, and we could produce it for super cheap because it would be only one type of shoe, so you wouldn't have to change the machines or fancy them up or have all these extras that go into it, and it would be super cheap for the production of shoes, and we could all buy our shoes for $2 because they would be like those shoes from Kmart, and we'd all have the same pair of shoes. So there's that's equality. So when we talk about socialism, and part of it is utilitarianism, and everybody's going to be equal, where you have to dress equally as well, and you have to look equal. So that's part of it, and that's the part that we don't like to talk about when we talk about the sexiness of socialism and everybody being treated equally and paid equally. We don't like to think of the utilitarianism aspect because we all like to be individual and we all like to be different in our country. So that's part of it that we have to think about. The second theory that comes from socialism is the theory of socialism itself. It's coined by Karl Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels. It's the idea that the factors of production are owned by the people, by everyone, equally. And so there has to be this kind of control to it, and that's where the evolution of communism is. It's a form of society where all the factors of production are controlled by the people through the government infrastructure. And a key to socialism and communism is that government infrastructure is going to be weak, so that it's shared equally amongst the people. In reality, we haven't seen that occur. And so part of where the divide between the ideas of Karl Marx and the reality of North Korea or China today is that their governments are too strong to have actual communism. They've created some hybrid where it's really an authoritarian government that controls everything, very similar to going back to before the French Revolution, like Louis XIV. He would be his style of government would be closer to what Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il do in North Korea than what Karl Marx envisions as a communist society. So if we were to compare capitalist ideas to Marxist ideas, especially when we're talking about theoretically, we have this table here that takes some of the major ideas. In Marxism, we focus a lot on the haves taking advantage of the have-nots, that the people on top of the capitalism food chain, the owners of the capital, take advantage of the labor and exploit them and use them poorly. And especially when Karl Marx is writing this information during the Industrial Revolution in London. Again, in an earlier movie, I talk about Charles Dickens writing It's the Best of Time, It's the Worst of Time. Well, Karl Marx is focusing on the worst of time. He's living through it. He's looking at people being exploited. He's watching children die in the factories, and he's saying this is an exploitation of the labor. The rich are becoming richer, and the poor are getting killed in these factories, and it's unfair. So he talks about that, and that's what he focuses on, the haves being taken advantage of by the have-nots. They talk about workers having to come together to fight against those employers and the profits of those employers, and eventually those workers will then become the owners, and everybody that works will be the owners of the factories, and so they can't exploit themselves, and it'll create this utopian society in the Marxist idea. And the capitalist side, we see they talk about progress resulting when individuals follow their own self-interests and what's best for them. Again, there has to be a selfishness for capitalism to work. If you're doing what's best for you, it's going to benefit other people. If you're trying to make as much money as possible, if you're Bill Gates trying to run Microsoft and trying to get it as big as possible, well, we can all have operating systems that function better than the original Windows that he created, because he's trying to make more and more money and more profit. And that's the idea of capitalism. Consumers are going to compete with each other to choose the best products at the cheapest amount. That's going to benefit everybody. And eventually workers are also going to be able to compete for the best jobs. So they're going to be the best workers possible to get the best jobs and the best pay. And again, it focuses on government not interfering in the economy. So we're going to see this leads to a couple of different reform movements happening throughout the world, starting in England and the United States, and then spreading to those other industrialized nations. The first idea is unions. This is the idea that workers come together in a specific trade. So like teachers union or firefighters union or carpenters union, and they all come together and they create specific needs for the workers that they expect from the factory owners or from the job sites that they're working on. And if those needs aren't met, all of the workers are going to stop working. It becomes a very powerful tool in negotiating deals between the workers and their and their employers, so that they can get some of these safety measures that are necessary. At first, unions are frowned upon, and they try to get union busters to destroy the unions, and companies are fighting against the unions. Eventually, they become legal and they're protected by the government. This creates reform laws that are passed in Britain and the United States that start protecting the workers, especially children workers, and it sets work hours. You have to work 8-hour days, and if you work more than that, you're protected by getting overtime pay. This leads to a couple of other reform movements. The first one that's important is the abolitionist movement. With the increasing manufacturing, there's no longer a need for slavery. Slaves in factories don't work because you need certain levels of education to accomplish a lot of the tasks inside the factory. And part of the idea of slavery is that you keep them as uneducated as possible. The more educated a person becomes, the less they want to be bonded or controlled in a slavery setting. So the movement towards manufacturing society starts to end slavery. We see Europe is going to be first in ending the slavery that's taking place in their colonies, and eventually it'll move towards the United States, and we'll have an abolitionist movement in our country. The second reform movement is going to be a women's reform movement. They're going to start fighting for their rights now that they're out into the world and working in factories, not just at home and meant to work in the kitchen and make kids. We're going to see women looking for more rights to be equal to men. The third reform movement that happens is going to be the reform movement for education. It starts with Horace Mann, and he pushes for free education for everyone. This is part of what's necessity for having factories. You need an educated population to work in manufacturing sector. So let's educate everyone so that we have a huge manufacturing sector. And the more educated people become, the more they expect, the more rights they expect to have. And then we also see a prison reform movement where we have prisoners returning to useful lives after they serve their punishment. And it's not completely about punishing people, it's about reforming people to become useful members in society. That's all we have for the Industrial Revolution. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you filled out your note sheets. I hope you prepared for your test. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Again, I'm Mr. Hosking. Thanks for visiting me on the cyberweb.